Portis Media.
Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we have scheduled a visit to 10 different haunted houses. I'm sure you all will be thoroughly entertained. We also have the pleasure of introducing a fairly new narrator from the horror community, who I'm sure many of you will enjoy, called Miss Fearsome. A link to her channel is in the description and will be shown at the end of the video. If you'd like to check out her work, please do so. But for now, it's time to get comfortable so that our tour can begin, and let the darkness take control. This happened in Tepoztlán, Mexico City. When I was studying, I met my wife at UNAM, La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, while she studied medicine. When we got married, my father-in-law gave me a piece of land in Tepoztlán, where we decided to build a house. Little by little, we were building the house, and when it finished, we decided to have a celebration with friends and family. The party transcended without eventualities. However, when everyone had retired at dawn, we heard strange noises inside the house, like someone crying, the dragging of chains, and strong blows. This worried my wife a lot, as she believes in spirits and prayed for protection. I used to be skeptical of these things and did not give it any importance, as I was always trying to find a logical explanation. On one occasion, I went to work, and my wife called me on my mobile phone, asking me about a pair of mining boots that she found near the basement. I use these type of boots in my work, as I work in construction, but it seemed strange since I only owned one pair, and I was wearing them right now. When I got home, I found my wife somewhat worried when looking for these pair of boots. I found them at the entrance to the basement, next to a puddle of water. None of this had reason to exist, since the boots weren't mine, and there wasn't a water leak that could justify the large amount of water that was underneath the boots. We were, as you can imagine, fairly confused. At first I thought they must have been from one of my subordinates that could have possibly forgotten them there. But analysing them carefully, they were not the type of boots nor the brand that we usually use for work, which left me quite confused as to who they may belong to. We decided to throw them away. After that day, the wailing and the noises became louder and louder. It got to the point that we got used to them. However, my wife kept having terrible nights, and the praying continued. It was for this reason I decided to purchase a firearm, a .45 pistol, for anything that were to come along, so to speak. On one occasion, we went to my nephew's christening and returned to the house late at night. But since we were already tired, we went to bed to sleep. The main bedroom is located on the second floor, and to get there, we use a wooden staircase that creaks when pressing the steps. In the early morning, the creaking woke me, and I got up very nervously, and then all of a sudden the creaking stopped. I prepared the weapon, thinking that it may be a thief or a burglar, and something suddenly started punching the door as if it wanted to break it down. It gave me the impression that the thief had enormous strength, and at this point, my wife woke up abruptly, and I, with weapon in hand, instructed her to lock the door as soon as I left to confront the stranger. I opened the door suddenly, and clearly saw a man descending the stairs in a hurry when he saw that I was armed. I emptied the firearm, hitting him at least 5 times, watching the back of him roll down the stairs. "Call the police!" I yelled to my wife. Then I ran to the stairs, turned the light on, but to my surprise, there was no one there. However, the boots that we had thrown away months ago were there, but this time covered in a pool of blood. In this situation, my wife was so scared that she called a priest to bless the house, and I personally set those boots on fire until I personally saw them turn to ash. For some time, things seemed to be normal, so much so that we decided to have children and start a family. My wife also felt calmer when we brought one of her uncles home. Her uncle was an old man, and due to an accident at work had been left disabled. but his company made her feel very good. Everything was going well, so I started working out of state without concern. 3 months had passed since the final incident. It was already dark when I started returning home after a trip. My assistant and another trusted employee were with me. Upon arriving to the house, I was surprised to find the lights off. I thought perhaps we just experienced a power cut, but I could hear the television on, and I saw movement in the living room. I found my wife's uncle out of his chair. He had passed away, and I became immediately alarmed. I screamed for my wife and found her sitting in a pool of blood. She was crying. Thinking the worst, that someone had hurt her, I called the emergency services. The paramedics arrived and took my wife away, confirming that her integrity was fine but that she had lost the baby. Upon checking on the uncle, they confirmed his passing was due to cardiac arrest, and his face was absolute terror. Had it not been for my assistants and the other workers accompanying me and serving as witnesses, the police would have accused me of harming my wife and possibly even ending the life of her uncle, as they found nothing that suggested the entry was forced or evidence of a stranger to the home. My wife spent 3 weeks in intensive care, until she began to show improvement. When she woke up due to the trauma, she'd lost some memory. She doesn't even remember me. I've taken her to the psychiatrist, and even with hypnosis, we've tried to make her remember. But as soon as she starts to relive her memories, she becomes hysterical. "Here it comes! Here comes the one that's gonna harm us! Take care of him!" she shouts. But we've never been able to find out who he is or what he wants. Due to the state of her health, I was forced to confine her to a psychiatric hospital in Guadalajara City, and I visit her when possible, but she doesn't remember me and believes that I'm just a friend. After everything was over, I returned to the house, and the first thing I saw when I opened the door were the boots and a pool of blood next to the basement stairs. I haven't returned to the house that's uninhabited and has been impossible to sell.
Okay, I'm freaking out and genuinely feel sick right now. There's something really wrong going on. I live in a Chicago suburb. I don't know if this is necessary to mention. I don't know, I'm just panicking. We moved into this house earlier this year around the beginning of summer, and weird stuff started to happen even before we moved in. The house used to belong to my mum's boyfriend, and I would go over to help paint. The first thing that happened was to me. I decided to take a break from painting and sat down to text my group chat. As I was texting, I felt a cold breath run down my neck, and that's when I heard it. It sounded like a woman, and that detail is really important. I freaked out and ran to my mum to tell her what had just happened, but I was kind of excited because honestly, I do love a bit of the paranormal. Fast forward a few months and we'd already moved in. Things were good, and there was not much worth mentioning. Sometimes stuff would turn on by itself, and there would be the occasional feeling of being watched and seeing things from the corner of our eyes. But at that point we were used to it. More time passed and more stuff started happening. On one occasion, my mum was home alone, and she found all the kitchen cabinets opened by themselves. Oddly enough, that was the only time it had happened though. Then my little brother said he'd started to see a lady around the house. He started to get scared of being alone anywhere, even if it was him going to the bathroom. He had to always have someone standing outside the door waiting for him. One day it got worse, and he ran down the stairs screaming. We asked him what had happened, and he said a lady had chased him down the stairs, laughing. Then my little sister said she'd started to see a little kid around the house, and she was scared of him as well. It's gotten so bad that they can barely sleep at night. Things keep happening, and especially to my mum. My parents split a long time ago, so they live separately. My dad has his apartment, and my mum has her house, and sometimes my mum would send us to my dad's for a week or a weekend so she could get some work done and relax, as there's 5 of us kids and it's a lot to handle. So she would be alone by herself in the house, and she said that at night it feels like something doesn't let her sleep. She said at night something grabs her, and it feels like they stab her with sharp items in different places of her body. She constantly gets nightmares and always hears things moving throughout the day and night. These nightmares aren't normal. They consist of her chained down in a dark place. She has had this dream over and over again, and eventually she started to realize what was going on. She was giving birth to a baby in the dream, chained down and somewhere dark, with entities around her laughing. She said she'd started to go slowly insane when she was by herself, and she found herself wanting another baby, which isn't usual for her. She has been saying for years how she couldn't handle another baby, and it's too much stress. Then all of a sudden she's left alone with whatever is in the house, started going crazy, and then buying things to help with fertility. She's even admitted to how she feels like she's not herself. I feel like it's targeting her in particular, and she felt like she was literally going insane. She bought security cameras to try and confirm what was going on, because she feels like nobody believes her. There's cameras outside, all around the house, and inside every room. They alert her and send a notification when there is motion detected. Right now we are on a road trip and currently in Nebraska, far, far away from Illinois. My mum received an alert not too long ago on her phone, and when we reviewed the clip, you can clearly see an orb and a figure poking out from behind the wall. We're freaking out right now. It looks like a small figure. You can see the eyes and the head poke out, and then poke back in again. It got detected on our system as human, but that is clearly not the case. More activity was caught on video, and we're currently trying to download the footage. But we're new to this, so it might take a while. We're absolutely terrified. We don't know what to do. My mum and I have been having suicidal thoughts recently whilst in the house. It feels so negative, like it's causing all of this, which I know it is. My mum doesn't want to go to church for help, but I'm so scared for the well-being of our family. I don't know if any of this made sense, as I'm still trying to figure it all out. At this point, we don't think it's the house though. I think it's us. Every house we have lived in has had some kind of paranormal occurrence. The last house we tried to move into, we only lasted a week because we were terrified. It got so bad we genuinely thought it was an intruder at first, and we called the police. Even they were scared of the house. I'm convinced it's us, but now we have some sort of proof on tape. Does anyone have any ideas that don't require going to a church for help? My mum refuses to do so.
My parents bought the house I'm currently living in back in 1994. I hadn't been born yet, and wasn't until 2001, but my 3 brothers were present, and kids at the time. My mum and dad were finalizing everything until they had found out people were there, and left them pentagrams outside in the backyard, various in what was my brother's, Junior's, room, and in the front door with writing like, "We'll be back," in red. My mum was terrified and wanted to back out, but my dad convinced her and my brothers to stay. So they did. They acted as if none of that had happened and actively avoiding the conversation, and it worked for a while until my brother Junior would start hearing scratching and whispering in the vents. It started as just noises until he'd end up with night terrors back to back and some hallucinations about there being something or someone. Finally, my mum gave in after Junior cried about how scared he was to be in his room, and she contacted a local priest to bless the house. From there, all the noises and hallucinations and dreams stopped, and everything was okay for them. 2001 was the year I was born. Everything was okay until around me being 7, when I was dealing with some traumas regarding physical and other kinds of abuse from my father. As that was happening, I had the room upstairs where I began to hear creaks on the stairs. For my brother, it was his room in the vents, and for me it started as my room in the stairs. I'm not sure why, but none of my previous pets, and even little cousins and nephews, liked the stairs. They would bark at it, hiss at it, cry and point at the stairs, and my dad would tell me I was overthinking things, so I believed him and just lived with a lot of fear. Nothing further than that happened until I was around 11 or 12. I was in middle school and went searching through the shed in my backyard and discovered this satanic ritual book in Spanish. I asked my dad about it, and he was enraged that I had it and told me to be careful with it, and explained to me that it was my grandpa's and that he handed it down to him. He took it from me and locked it away in a box and left it at the highest shelf in the shed out back. A few months later, my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and my mum had him move with her downstairs to Junior's bedroom. I was moved to my parents' bedroom, which had its own bad history filled with trauma beside paranormal activity. My dad was never really a normal person, but when he had cancer he began acting really strange, and it would scare anyone, including my mum. Sometime in January of 2015, my dad entered a really weak state where you could tell he wasn't going to make it, and with the cold season, it became difficult for him to manage himself alone. He tried to distract himself with TV, which he'd just watch all night in the living room just below our room. One night I remember hearing the TV turn on, and before heading to bed I checked to see if he was okay. He was fine, watching TV, so I went to bed. 5 minutes later I hear a slam on the door, and I go to check to see him gone. I tried to reassure myself by thinking he went to take a breather and look at the stars like he usually liked to do. So again I went back to bed. 15 or so minutes pass and I'd wake up quickly to the sound of banging on the door. I'd go check and see my dad crying while locked outside. What really confused me about this was at the time our front door had been uneven and broken to where you needed to physically lift the door panel with a good amount of force to unlock it. My dad was no way near strong enough to do something like this when I'd even struggled with it myself. I unlocked the door and let him in, for him to tell me in a panicked daze that he heard my mum call him outside. I got more confused and explained my mum was sound asleep in Junior's old room, and that she had never left the room once, not even to go outside. He was so convinced she was outside calling him, he would try to show me, but there was no one outside nor any voices for that matter. I then woke up Mum and brought her to Dad and had him explain what happened. She was terrified. She told us she didn't hear any banging at all, even though she's only several feet away from the door. It terrified us to know I could hear, but she couldn't. My mum told me to go to bed, but I didn't, and for several weeks after that I was alert and scared. I think it was around early February my dad woke me up one day early in the morning, dragged me outside to the backyard and began whispering in Spanish while he pulled around me in a circle. It lasted for several minutes, and when he was done he didn't tell me anything and went to bed. I told my brother Christopher about it, and he quickly took me to his friend's mum, who was a spiritual healer. I didn't understand it, and I'm still confused to this day. My father passed on March 5th in a hospice, and things began happening soon after. I told Chris about the book my dad had, and when I showed him the box it was locked in, we cracked it open to find that it wasn't there anymore. My mum took my bedroom and I moved into Junior's room, where I still am currently. I hear things in the vent sometimes, and I've gotten sleep paralysis twice. Once, I saw something in my backyard creep into my bedroom. My current pet, a cat, has this strange thing where she's calm and relaxed and suddenly alert and staring at the corners of the walls. My nephews hate going into my room and stay away from the stairs still. Junior and I recently talked about these experiences, and I was telling him I wanted to move out of the house. He agreed with me and told me that if I don't feel safe I should leave quickly. With all of this out the way, my question is, Am I just overthinking things? And worrying about something that I should have moved on about years ago? Or should I still be worried about this? Is there anything I can do?
So this isn't the scariest of stories, nor is it my scariest, but this is definitely one that I tend to think about a lot. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, but when I was young we moved to Virginia with my mum's parents, where my little sister was born. We lived there for about 7 years before my dad wanted to live around his family again, so moving was a process. We moved around a lot, even before we decided to leave, and we lived in apartments mostly. In order to get everything we owned to New Orleans, we needed to remove some belongings from a storage room and my grandparents' attic. The amount of stuff was a lot, to say the least. We moved into an intermediate house, as my parents called it, and it was huge, or at least it was to 7-year-old me. It had a large grassy backyard and a good half a mile between any neighbours we had. The house had 2 very spacious bedrooms, an attic, 2 bathrooms, a large kitchen and a pantry, a nice-sized living room and a good dining room. For 2 kids who had only lived in apartments and slept over at their grandparents' 1-story house, it was a dream, as there were so many places to explore and crawl around in. But the most unique characteristic about this looming 2.5-story house was the paint. It was a faded royal purple. Now, living in a rural part of Virginia, you don't see houses painted like that often. However, anyone with a functioning frontal lobe could tell you that the house was not right. It just felt odd, like we weren't supposed to be there. Corny, I know, but that's how it felt. The house was obviously a good few decades old, and thinking about its architecture, it probably dated back to the late 50s, early 60s. You see, my parents aren't that big into spirits and the paranormal, but they swear whatever that house was, it wasn't good. I can't remember the first time I experienced something out of the norm, though to be honest there was nothing normal about that house. But the earliest occurrence was when my sister and I really didn't want to go to bed. We would play under the covers, roll under our beds, and crawl into the closet. We'd do whatever we could to have fun past our bedtime. One thing we'd love doing was playing in the bathroom, in between our parents' bedroom and ours. And I don't know why, but we just loved it. Well, we were in the bathtub with no water, roughhousing. Once we'd gotten tired, we left. Now I was 7, but I sure as hell wasn't dumb. I knew how to unlock and open a door, but I did just that, and it wouldn't open. I then tried it the other way, but it wouldn't budge. I locked it and then unlocked it, but nothing worked. It just wouldn't open. At this point, my little sister was freaking out, as it felt like someone was holding the door shut. I started shouting for it to go away and began crying just like my sister. I had to do something. Eventually, all the commotion woke up my parents, and they came to us. They opened the door with little effort and began scolding us. The door wasn't now the immovable object it was a few seconds ago. Another thing to mention were the noises. The groaning of the foundation and doors were constant. Tapping of the walls and sounds of stressed wood, almost like a really old board was being stepped on by a 400-pound sumo wrestler. These sounds filled our rooms at night. Living in this house was also the start of my sister and I developing chronic migraines. She suffers with the worst ones, but we both still experience them to this day. The first time my little sister got one, though, was really scary. She was taking a bath while I was helping my mum with dinner. Well, mostly sneaking peeks at Star Wars, which my dad was watching in the living room. When suddenly there was a screech. Not a scream or a cry, but a screech of pure pain and agony. We all ran upstairs to the bathroom, which was locked, although my parents never locked the bathroom door when we were young, and my mum and I were trying to convince her to calm down and at least open the door, but all she did was scream and cry. Finally, my dad had had enough and broke the door down. She looked horrible. She was pale and was still screaming and shaking, not even acknowledging us. Hours later, she was still shivering, and every once in a while whispering that it hurt. A few days later, I experienced one myself and passed out from the amount of pain it gave me. We were there for about a month only, but somehow it felt like forever. I honestly felt like the house was trying to kill or harm us so much that we had to leave.
This is a story that my husband shared with me. He experienced this inside of his home back in 2014. He lived in rural Pushmata County in southeast Oklahoma. He was in a dark period of his life back then. We had separated for about 7 months. He was spending a lot of time with people who didn't have his best interests at heart. He was into things that I didn't agree with, and his life spiraled out of control. One night he was laying on the couch in his living room. He kept his house pitch black for some reason. He said he could feel a presence in the room with him. He couldn't explain, it was just a feeling of knowing. He decided to take out his camera phone and take some pictures of the areas he was feeling the negative energy, and he said he caught a figure in the photos. He said the first picture was of the front door entrance, and there stood a figure of a clown. He said it had orange, wiry brush hair, but was bald on top. Its face was white. The next picture was of the entrance to the hallway, where it stood again looking at him. Then the third picture we took was a selfie, while he laid there on the living room couch. He said that this time the demonic clown was crouched down behind him, smiling with a red, twisted, evil sneer. Its teeth were jagged and dirty, and it wore dirty old clothes. He couldn't believe the pictures he was seeing. He also chased this thing down and confronted it, but soon regretted it. He said a feeling of fear and dread came over him. He left his home after this and didn't go back for a day or two. My husband also captured photos of some shadowy figures going down a portal in the hallway that looked like it just rolled underground into a basement. His house didn't have a basement. He used the shutter feature on his phone. To be sure he wasn't just seeing things, he showed his cousin the pictures, and his cousin is a born-again Christian after some rough times. But his cousin asked him how he did that. He couldn't believe the pictures and refused to go back on the land. Another time he ended up chasing some shadowy figures he thought were people towards the church located near his home. He thought someone broke into his house and stole some of my clothes because they were carrying some suitcase. He chased them past the church, which was surrounded by a forest, and he said they moved too fast to be human, and they vanished into darkness behind the church. He gave the phone to his mother because he didn't know what else to do. He said he felt compelled to keep taking pictures and videos, but his mum thought it was contributing to his negative lifestyle. I asked her if she still had the phone, but she said that she got rid of it. He has also seen a little child sitting on an old antique tobacco box table thing we bought at a yard sale. We kept it in a room across from the hallway bathroom. He didn't see a face, just the feet dangling down like it was sitting on top of it. These things happened while we were separated. I've had my own experiences there as well. Not as intense nor crazy, but still unexplainable.
The story I'm about to tell you was back in 2005 in Bhutan, when I was 9 years old. For those of you who don't know where Bhutan is, it's a small country in Asia with a population of less than 900,000. The entire country is a forest, and since many people believe and practice Buddhism, the paranormal activity that goes on there is quite normal. We used to live in a good community in one of the highest populated towns in Bhutan. We had neighbours, and there was never a time I didn't hear about strange things happening or those which happened in the area. After a while, my dad was transferred to a remote and isolated place. Our new, one-storied house was in the middle of a forest, and our neighbour's house was at least 600 metres away from ours in the mountainous countryside, so we couldn't see the neighbour's house from ours. Now, this particular incident happened to my mum. The day we moved into the new house, my dad had to leave to go to another town for a meeting that same day, and that night, my mum, younger sister and I slept in the same room, as it was the first night and many things needed to be unpacked. The next morning I heard my mum talking to my dad over the phone about the strange sounds she'd heard the night before. I could tell from my mum's voice that my dad wasn't convinced by what she was telling him. I wanted to ask Mum what had happened, so I waited until she was done talking on the phone. I asked, and she told me that she'd heard the sound of someone walking outside late at night. I then asked what Dad said about it, and she told me that he thought it must have been some wild animals, since we were in the middle of a forest. I pressed my mum on whether it was the sound of a person in particular that was walking, and she said yes. They had done 10 rounds of the house perimeter. Dad arrived home after a few days. We had late dinner, and my sister and I went to sleep in our bedrooms, and my elder brother was watching television, so he wanted to sleep on the couch. Everyone was now asleep. During the night, my mum heard my brother wake up, so she called his name and asked him if he was going to the toilet. He answered a yes. My brother, sister and I shared a common toilet, which was at the far end of the house. My brother then came back from the toilet and wished my mum a good night and went back to sleep. Mum was about to fall asleep when she heard my bedroom door open. She thought it must be me coming to her room so that she could take me to the toilet. Now, I used to wear glass Cinderella heels at home. They would be outside my bedroom door, and every time I would go to the toilet or anywhere in the house, I would wear them. I'd wake my mum and take her along with me too, because for some reason I never liked the toilet in that house. My mum waited for me to come to her and wake her up to go to the toilet. She could hear the sound of my Cinderella heels coming towards her bedroom, and she waited. The heel sound stopped right outside her room, and wondered why I hadn't come in and what I was doing. She said she didn't hear me go back to my room, but the sound of the heels just stopped outside her and Dad's room. That's when she realized something was wrong. She turned around to the side where my dad was sleeping, and she saw that my dad was staring at her, his face on the pillow. "I heard that too," he whispered. They both woke up, turned on the bedroom light, and went out to check the hallway. My heels were right outside my bedroom, and not in front of theirs like they thought. The next day, Dad went to the neighbours to ask about any history they knew of about our house. They told him that it had been built above a cremation ground, and the previous tenant had moved out because the house was haunted. After that, my dad apologised to my mum for not believing her, and within a week we moved out.
Let me preface this by saying I have never believed in ghosts or the paranormal, but I've always been an avid horror fan. This is a series of events that happened over the span of about a week. I had just rented a house with a couple of my buddies. It had 4 bedrooms, the 2 biggest ones being on the 2nd floor and the smaller ones up on the 3rd. Of course, my mates got the pick of the rooms on the 2nd floor, and I was left with the choice of one of the 2 upstairs rooms. I thought it would be cool to pick the room with the balcony, but at night, I was already having second thoughts. That night, when I went up to bed, I was exhausted, so I decided to lock my door to prevent my friends from waking me up in the morning. When I did wake up, my door was wide open. I asked my friends if they had unlocked it using the skeleton key, but they told me they had no idea what I was talking about. Fast forward to 2 nights later, I'm laying in bed scrolling through Twitter, and it's about 3 a.m. That's when I hear footsteps outside of my bedroom door. I ignore it, thinking it was just one of my friends. Then about 2 minutes later, there's a small knock on my door. I of course yell for my friend to go away, but the knocking continued, so eventually I got up to see what was going on. I open my door and am shocked to find out that there's no one outside. Just feeling a little unsettled, I decide to leave my lights on all night. The next night, I was awoken by a tight feeling in my chest. When I looked up, I was terrified to find an old man sitting there. I had never had sleep paralysis before, so I was totally freaked out. He just sat there and stared deep into my eyes. I felt like he was consuming my soul. I must have been laying there for at least an hour, because he only got up and walked out the room when daybreak hit. I had trouble sleeping the next night, but eventually gave in to sleep deprivation. I had this insane dream that the old man had taken a knife and plunged it into my stomach, and that I had passed away. It was honestly terrifying. The next morning I woke up with the worst stomach cramp I ever had in my life, and I just felt so sick that I threw up. But when I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror afterwards, I noticed a scratch mark right across my abdomen, where in my dreams, he had plunged the instrument. It was pretty deep and certainly hadn't been there before. The last straw was when I packed my stuff and decided to drive out to my mum's house to stay with her. On the way, I called the landlord and asked him if there had been anyone passing away in the house. He told me the previous tenant was an old schizophrenic man who often thought he had ended the lives of others. He told me the man had loved to sit on the balcony and smoke, and one day he just apparently snapped and was found hanging from there. Let's just say I never went back to the house, and I can tell you with certainty that I now do believe in ghosts.
When I was 18, I purchased my first home. It was a small, run-down foreclosure property that I paid next to nothing for, so was a perfect fixer-upper for my young son and I. My dad is a carpenter, and so he was able to do most of the updates for me before we moved in. Dad didn't tell me outright that anything supernatural had ever happened to him whilst there, but on one occasion, when I arrived at the house to help out, he asked me, "Was that you a little while ago?" "No, I just got here," I said. He just shrugged it off. Another time he was under the house working on something, and he kept hearing footsteps above him. Convinced it was my mum or me, he yelled a few times before assuming we couldn't hear him and giving up. I didn't chalk these up to paranormal experiences though, because I had never really had one before and wasn't even sure I believed in them. Fast forward to when my son and I had moved into the house. I slowly started noticing odd occurrences. I was constantly thinking I heard the door to the breezeway open and close, and the sound of shuffling as if somebody was arriving home, but of course nobody was there. The sound of footsteps upstairs was also very common. The first time my boyfriend came to the house and stayed the night, we were fast asleep, when suddenly the stereo came on at full blast, scaring the heck out of us. The next morning we were sitting at the bar in the kitchen, having breakfast, and we began discussing the previous night's events, when my boyfriend proclaimed, "If there really is something in this house, I wish it would just show itself." As soon as he finished his sentence, we heard a loud crash, and as we turned to look, a mini cooler was tumbling down the stairs with enough force that it left a dent in the wall at the bottom of the staircase. On another occasion, my boyfriend, our son and myself were all sleeping in the living room. It was a very hot summer, and we didn't have central air conditioning at that time, so we had pulled the mattress out onto the living room floor, where there's a window AC unit. At around 3 a.m. we awoke to the sound of an alarm clock going off. Now we didn't use an alarm clock, so we jumped up to try to find the source of the noise so it wouldn't wake our son. I'll never forget when I found it. I followed the noise to a plastic bag that was beside the couch that had some of my boyfriend's belongings in. I pulled out the alarm clock and was frantically hitting the buttons, trying to get it to stop, before I decided to just unplug it. When I grabbed the cord, I realized it wasn't plugged into anything at all. I just held it, staring at it, then held it up for my boyfriend to see before it just suddenly stopped. The next day he inspected the clock, convinced it had batteries in it, but it didn't even have a battery compartment. The final story I'd like to share with you was the scariest of all to me. I was in the living room watching TV while my son slept quietly upstairs. The baby monitor was beside me, and from my position I could look straight up the stairs and see the door to my son's room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the upstairs hallway, and simultaneously there was a short burst of static interference on the baby monitor. The hairs on my arms stood straight up, and I just stared up at the stairs, at my son's door. The hallway was illuminated by a nightlight, and my son's door was white, so I could see fairly well. It looked like a head was peeking out of the room across the hall from my son's door, but I thought surely it was my imagination. Until after about a minute, this being stepped out. It didn't glide across the floor like you see in the movies. Its movements were so human-like, distinct and three-dimensional, that if it hadn't been a stark black silhouette, I would have thought it was an intruder. It stepped out of the doorway and took a couple of steps across the hall to my son's door, then turned its head like it wanted to check if I was watching before it stuck its head and shoulders through the door of my son's bedroom, as if to have a peek to see what was in there. When it did this, I mustered the courage to yell a no. Then it pulled out its head and quickly dematerialized. It was like it shrunk into itself until nothing was left. I have goosebumps just writing this. I bounded up the stairs, grabbed my son and left the house immediately. I stayed the night at my mum's for about a week after that, and eventually I sold the house.
A co-worker of mine named Haley lives in a haunted house and has done since she was a kid. It was built in the 1940s and purchased by her parents in the 1980s. Her parents' renovations of the home are suspected to have set off the paranormal activity. They still experience haunting activity to this day, and it's the usual type of activity you'd expect in a haunted house. The unexplained noises, objects being moved, the feeling of a presence, and the possibility of random, seeing, fleeting shadows in the corners of your vision at any time of the day. No one's ever been physically harmed from what she told me. Her whole family accepts it and lives with it. I asked about the most frightening experience that happened. She said the most uncomfortable story happened to her father. Haley's dad was babysitting her little cousin Tommy. Tommy was about 6, coloring at the kitchen table, while her uncle was busy preparing lunch for them. The kitchen table center of the room was lined up to see the back door. The door had a window to see into the backyard. Tommy began giggling and then turned to laughter. Uncle turned around, amused at the outburst, and asked what was so funny. Tommy looked straight ahead towards the back door. He's being funny. Haley's dad looked in the direction Tommy faced but saw nothing. I don't see anyone. Thinking Tommy was using his imagination and being creative, his next question was, "Is there someone there? Then what does your friend look like?" Tommy was smiling and still half giggling and responded with enthusiasm, "There's a man. He's white like paper. He has no hair and his eyes are really red." Tommy described this man even more, looking back and forth between his uncle and the air. "He's standing outside smiling at me. He's got funny teeth. They're all pointy. Also, he's wearing white clothes. He says he's your friend." Haley's dad said he never felt so targeted until that moment, and stated to Haley he felt his face go pale in response to Tommy. "No, Tommy, I don't have any friends like that. Stop talking and tell him to go away." Tommy's smile instantly dropped. He looked back over to the window and gave a response. "No, you can't come in." Tommy looked away quickly and lowered his head. The rest of the day went on quietly, and Tommy never brought up the man again.
My uncle bought a house about a year ago, and has had some really weird experiences since doing so. I have tried researching the house and its address for any related information, but nothing comes up. So a tiny bit of backstory. My uncle, let's call him Uncle Bill, is in his mid-60s and is married to a beautiful woman, Aunt G, who is around the same age and has 2 daughters and a grandchild. When he was younger, he started an electrician business in Colorado, which quickly became a family business. My 3 and only uncles have worked in this business as electricians for as long as I can remember, and my mum, Uncle Bill's younger sister, moved away to start a family when she was younger, which is how I was brought into this world. Uncle Bill and Aunt G are very wealthy. They take many extravagant vacations and have a very nice house in Colorado, which is their home base. They own over 6 houses in Colorado and other states, and a lot of really nice cars that they love to drive around. Their most recent real estate purchase was in Nebraska. They found a large antique home built in the early 1900s that was situated in the middle of nowhere, so they immediately fell in love with it. It isn't their permanent residence, but more like a vacation home to get away for a week or 2 every month. After the purchase of the house, they learned some interesting facts about it. One of them being that the previous owner who lived in the house with her family for many years had accidentally run over her very young son in the driveway and killed him. I only say accidentally in quotations because I am unsure of the full story. They also recently found out how the previous owner to the woman that ran over her child was a woman in her 40s who had hung herself in the house. When Uncle Bill and Aunt G began moving in items, they quickly realized something was off. In the basement, the thermostat would act strangely. Since the house was so cold and not much renovation had been done on it, it was still one of the old dial thermostats, where you turn it right and left to control the temperature. That night, Uncle Bill had set it to around 70 degrees and gone upstairs to bed. But the next morning, he found the thermostat set to the highest temperature that it could go, causing blasting heat all over the house. Now, I don't know anything about HVAC or electrical appliances, but Uncle Bill has explained that there is no way it could have changed on its own. He checked the wires and saw nothing wrong. It would have to be manually adjusted, and he was the only one in the house at the time, as Aunt G is constantly in and out of the country for business. The next night he thought of a way to beat the system. He took Scotch tape and taped the thermostat, thinking it was loose and was turning by itself gradually throughout the night. The next morning he saw that the tape had been removed, and the heat was turned on full blast again. He ended up removing the thermostat completely after that. Now, Uncle Bill and Aunt G don't sleep in the same room. It sounds strange, I know. Well, to me at least. But they've done it for years, and it works for them, so who am I to judge? One evening in the middle of the night, Uncle Bill woke up to Aunt G standing over him in bed, just staring at him. Another night he woke up to standing in the downstairs living area, rapidly plugging and unplugging the television into the outlet over and over again. The biggest and scariest event that happened was when they both accidentally fell asleep in Uncle Bill's room while watching a show. Uncle Bill, on the verge of sleep, but not quite, felt like he and the bed were being lifted. Then as quickly as he realized it, the bed dropped back down onto the floor. Aunt G woke up from the feeling of being dropped, and the both of them shot up and out of bed. As they quickly grabbed each other and got up, they realized the bed had been lifted into the air, shifted, and slammed back down onto the ground. They know this because the bedroom is carpeted and has indents of where the bed was set. And when they got up, the bed was shifted at least 4 inches away from its normal place. There have been some other small incidents, but I can't remember them right now. I would like to point out that my uncle is not superstitious and is very trustworthy and intelligent. He has never believed in the paranormal, or is even religious. But does anyone have any advice? I fear for their safety and their friends and family that are going to stay with them in the future. My family is going to visit them soon, and we refused to stay in the house like many others. Can anyone make me and my family more comfortable with them staying there? Is there anything we should know when dealing with this kind of stuff?
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for attending our haunted house tour today. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to let me know. You can leave your reviews in the usual place. I would like to extend a huge thank you for our guest tour guide in today's viewings, Miss Fearsome. If you did enjoy her work, she is excellent, if I do say so myself. You can find a link at the end of my video. Oh, there it is. And in the description. So be sure to check her out, as she's got some cracking content and is really up and coming. So I'm going to leave you with that. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.